Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Samantha and I like to post sewing videos every week. This week's video is about face masks, and I think we're all tired of seeing videos on the internet of how to sew a face mask, but this is just a little different. Bear with me. It's about taking a mask that you already own and creating a pattern out of it, and then creating your own face masks from that pattern. And what I like about this is it's budget friendly and you can customize a mask however you want. You can use whatever fabrics you want. If you're interested in learning how I do this, please keep watching. Okay, I'm jumping right in. I'm taking the mask that I want to recreate and I fold it in half on that center seam, and I'm going to trace directly around it, being careful not to shift it around as I trace. Once you are finished tracing your mask, now it is time to add some seam allowance to the pattern. I like to go with a 1/2 inch most of the time. I'm trying to do it by sight, but then I realized it doesn't look right, so I grabbed a ruler and I'm going around and doing a 1/2 inch. Some days I can do it by sight, and other days you just need your ruler. Just depends, I guess. And here I'm just switching tools because that large ruler was a little awkward to use, so I'm switching over to my seam gauge, and I'm just continuing to add the 1/2 inch seam allowance to the pattern. This is where you are not just going to add 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to add an inch, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sew it together. So there's my 1/2 inch, but then I'm going to fold another 1/2 inch over to put the elastic through. So that's why I'm adding an inch here instead of 1/2 inch. And then you need 2. So there's your pattern. If you happen to have a rotary cutter, I would use that instead of fabric scissors because I find there's a lot less slippage whenever you're cutting the pieces out of your fabric. This is the pattern that I want to quickly show you the difference between patterns. The first one is the one I just recreated from a mask that I already have, and then the second one is one that I just kind of freehanded. That second one, I probably had to make 4 masks before I finally got the fit right, but with the first one, since I traced it from a mask that already fits well, I saved myself a lot of time doing it that way. Okay, here are our pieces, and this is how we're going to start. This is going to be one side, right sides together, and then because I want this shiny fabric to be the other side, we're going to flip that right over like that. And we are going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance this center seam right here and right here. Because this fabric is really stretchy and slippery, I'm running it through my machine and doing some test stitches so that I can get the tension right before I actually start sewing my mask. This is actually really good practice for any sewing project you do, not just for this one in particular. And then I'm going ahead and doing that center seam that I said. And when you make a lot of masks, a helpful tip is to do what is called chain stitching, which is just running one in right after the other, and it saves you a lot of time and a lot of thread. When I'm done doing that, I trim my seam allowance down, and then I match the mask pieces, basically the two panels, right sides together, and I start by matching it at the seam and then going out from there. So I'm just showing you again on this other mask a little bit more in detail. I'm taking the two panels that we've now stitched together, and then you're going to butt them up right next to each other in the center seam, and then go ahead and pin or clip around it. I'm just using clips for this one because this is a knit material, but if I had a cotton material, I'd just use pins. Make sure that when you stitch around this, you leave a 2 to 3 inch gap so that we can turn it right side out. Okay, so just to clarify what this step is, we are taking the two panels, right sides together, and we're stitching around with that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we are going to leave a hole so that we can turn it. And the reason I'm starting in the center is because this fabric is really slippery, so I didn't want it to move around too much, so I started at the seam before I start stitching anything else. I just stitch from the seam out basically, and this is not necessary if you're using something that doesn't slip like cotton, but this material is really slippery, so I had to do that. Go ahead and trim your seam allowance down, turn everything right side out, get your corners pushed out really nicely, and then we're going to press. Whenever I press this, I start from the outside and work my way in because this is a 3-dimensional shape. We can't just take our iron and stick it on there and just run it across. You kind of have to work with it a little bit. So just grab your iron and press it really nicely, get everything nice and flat. Don't do that. And then we're going to top stitch, and we're going to be careful when we top stitch to make sure that we get that gap closed that we had to leave earlier. And then I take a 10-inch piece of elastic, and I first hold the mask up to my face or my child's face, and I kind of see where I need this elastic to be before I tie it and cut it. And then remember that 1/2 inch that I was talking about earlier, why we needed a full inch instead of a 1/2 inch? We're going to fold that 1/2 inch piece over with the elastic in it once we've tied it and cut the ends off, and we're going to stitch it down. Okay, so stitch it down and do that on both sides, and then the mask is done. It's pretty simple. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.